Traveling to consciousness, exploring spiritual journeys to find answers in uncertainty.
What is up, conscious monkeys? Welcome back to another episode of, I guess this is a catch up with Clayton episode, and I'm sure as you could tell by the title and the format length, that this is not going to be the normal episode that you see on a Monday. And I'm going to get into why that is. Also in this episode, if you stick around, I'm going to get into my recommendation to you if you're thinking about doing content creation or even starting a podcast, which I know is a little bit different, but I promise you there's a nugget of information in here for everybody. And it ties into why this episode is more of a housekeeping episode, because I want to give you guys updates. I want to keep you guys in the loop of what's going on. It's my way of saying thank you to you guys for being such dedicated listeners. I really do appreciate it from the bottom of my heart. So the number one big thing that may quote unquote affect you the most is the format that I'm going to be using with the large podcasts moving forward. So it's really been kind of gnawing at me a couple of things. Number one, always constantly getting people to come on the platform, because it's not the largest community in the world, if you will. And on top of that, it's a lot of energy. It's a lot of energy to sit down with people and talk for 3 hours, which I love doing. So I don't want it to seem like it's coming from that vein. But where my state is, and this is something we'll kind of get into at the end whenever I get back into why podcasting might not be the first thing you approach, but it's taking a lot of my energy to produce this, and not sure how to articulate this. And it seems to me that things are still moving at the same pace. And I love seeing change. I love seeing things move and grow. So it's in my best interest, and quite frankly, your best interests as well, that I make this little pivot. So what is that little pivot? As you know, these episodes are like 2.5 to 3 hours long, which I'm sure you love, which is why you're here. But I believe that there's a barrier to entry problem. And this is really the key point here, is that there's a barrier to entry problem with new people coming on board, right? They don't know me. They don't know my guest. There's no reason for them to click on this podcast. So what I have devised, if you will, after countless feedback on this, which is I need to shrink these podcasts down to an hour. Now, telling me that gave me a lot of anxiety and a lot of like, fuck that energy. Like, I'm not going to do that. And what I came to realize is that I believe I have found a way to still preserve the 3-hour nature and condense it into a 1-hour podcast. And here's what I've come up with. So what I will be doing starting in July is release the first hour of the podcast on a Monday. The second Monday, I'll release part 2, which will be the second hour. And then the following Monday will be the third hour of the podcast. So this really solves multiple issues at once. And I think it will also help the guests a lot, because it gets them a lot more exposure, because now they're in 3 podcasts as opposed to only 1. New people coming in, they can see it. And on top of this, I know if you guys are listening, because I know there are some of you out there who listen to every single minute, every single week. For those guys, I do apologize, but I've got to do what's in the best interest of me and helping others and spreading this. So the way that I'll format it is that once all of the parts release, you'll be able to just kind of queue them up so that it just flows straight through. So, the first hour, and once part 1 of the first hour ends, I'm not going to put any filler on it. And part 2 of that will then pick up right where part 1 left off. So if you just kind of queue them up, it'll be synchronistic. Hope that made sense. And so I hope that, I hope that made sense. But with that being said, let me see here, looking at my notes. I made some notes for the housekeeping. I kind of alluded to it in there. I'm going to be taking a little bit of a break for this week and next week. And this kind of gets on top of this whole housekeeping theme as well, which is I had 2 interviews lined up last week. Was it 2 weeks ago? Last week. And both of them had to cancel the day of, which to me, I'm just like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. They had like emergencies, they were flying out of town, just crazy shit. And so I'm sitting there and thinking about it. And I'm like, okay, like, why is this happening? And to me, I believe a portion of it was this, to uncover that I needed to make this pivot in the format, to uncover this new way that I need to be approaching the podcast and you guys. And there was another thing that kind of popped up here that I'm going to get into in this last little bit, which is going to be my advice for a very small niche of you guys, but good advice nonetheless. So before I move on to that, I do want to say I really do appreciate you guys understanding. This is not something that's easy for me to do, because there's something about me. Whenever I see that thing say podcast and then like 3 hours, I just light up. I light up. And so I know there's some of you out there that light up as well. I don't want to offer this as my apology to you guys, but hopefully this is the best interest of humanity as a whole, as these messages should get to more people, because I know that that is a deterrent for the large majority of the population. And fair, by all means fair. If you don't know me, if you don't know the guest, why in the world would you click it? So I do want to just say that I really appreciate you guys sticking with me, and hopefully this will also push to examine smaller bits of it at a time, as opposed to 3 hours of just a massive amount of information. You'll now be able to take part one and apply that in your week, and then move on to part two and see how that compounds itself onto you in your life. Hopefully that made sense as well. So I think that there's a strong thing here. I don't know quite what it is, but there's a lot of good here. And this moves into our last part of it, right? Which is kind of what I was hinting at, and why I'm making this pivot as well, which is what podcasting kind of is and the people who do it. And what I've noticed is that a lot of the people who are in the podcasting scene, it's not their primary source of income, or at least they didn't start off with the podcast. They had a side business beforehand. They were popular on YouTube, getting enough money through creator funds. They were, I don't know, some sort of money on the side. They were a business coach or something, and they started a podcast afterwards. And it kind of clicked with me that I took the exact opposite route, which has been difficult. I'll be honest. I mean, running a podcast is not well, it's probably your perception of it too. There's pieces of it that are difficult, and it's a lot of energy, and it's really time consuming. And over this past week, I've realized that I need to start putting some energy into other fields, if you will. I love talking to people and it's great, but for all those reasons I mentioned before, I also need to find some more time in order to put into avenues of growth monetarily. I mean, and just making other content, because instead of doing 3 hours of interview every week, right, I'm now going to be able to just do 3 hours of interview once every 3 weeks, which is huge in my opinion. That opens up so much more time. What is that? That's 6 hours a week that gets opened up, and not even that, just but even the creative energy as well. So hopefully you guys fully understand this. And I guess my recommendation here that I was going to get to for you guys, which is don't start a podcast. If you don't have any other revenue stream or like income, and it's your first time viewing content creation, personally, I think podcasting is probably the most difficult to grow an audience, in my opinion. But I do know people who grow crazy, ridiculous podcasts and have a very small audience on TikTok or Instagram. So with that being said, I do want to make a very strong caveat, which is listen to your internal voice. If your internal voice is saying, dude, Clayton's wrong on this, make that podcast, then make that podcast. Fucking do it. That's what I recommend to you. If that inner voice is saying, yeah, I'm not really sure, then I think this is your sign that don't start with the podcast. Use that as like a backup plan to implement down the road. So that's what I've got for you guys. The formats are going to be switching. Going to take a break for these 2 weeks. I'll keep putting out Catch Up with Clayton episodes on the Thursdays, but the Mondays are going to kind of stall a little bit. Still playing around with all that. We'll see what happens. And then, yeah, podcasting is a luxury, man. But so if you're able to do it, you're really truly blessed. With all that being said, I really appreciate you guys being here. Please leave a rating wherever you guys are listening to this, because that helps me so much more. That helps everybody involved. It's really a zero cost way for you to give back to the podcast, to help me. Hopefully it's a nice little even energy exchange. And I know based off of the numbers I've got here that not everybody is leaving reviews. So if you're listening to this, you got to ask yourself, why are you not leaving a review? Huh? You think the algorithm's listening or something? You think you hate listening? Are you hate listening to me? Which is cool too. But please consider leaving a review. And with that being said, if you don't, then I guess we'll have to find another way to talk about it, which will be whenever I see you in the sixth dimension.